It is February 2017. You just turn on your PC and look through the never-ending waves of games being released on Steam, just as you see a game called Hollow Knight. Looking at it, you're reminded of games like Ori and the Blind Forest or Metroid that you had played previously, and you decide to play it, and as you traverse through its maze-like caverns, you slowly fall in love. You're also blissfully unaware that in that point in time, you stand at the precipice of the start of the golden age of Metroidvania games, and also the precipice of the first problems starting to show. And now in 2024, and many Metroidvanias later, we are all blissfully unaware that the golden age might just be coming to an end. This is the impending fall of Metroidvania games, a semi-professional study on the future of the genre. There are more Metroidvanias than ever now. It is hard to stand out among dozens if not hundreds of competitors all on the same platform. For everything that follows, I use the Steam store as my database. And for this first part, we will look at how many Metroidvania games released on Steam over the years. Of course, there have also been games that were released elsewhere as console exclusives or on different stores like itch, but Steam is far and wide the biggest collection of games anywhere, so that's why I chose Steam. Here's the graph. Our graph starts in 2008 with our first Metroidvania being released, but we only see the first uptake in games in 2012. From then on out, it develops steadily, and just as we reach a first decline in 2017, the year Hollow Knight released, the years after its release show a really steep increase in game output, eventually moving from 57 in 2017 to 119 in 2020 to 241 in 2023. In the first half of 2024, 119 Metroidvania games have already been released, so if you follow that trend in the full year of 2024, another 230 to 250 Metroidvanias will have been released on Steam. Let's also overlay this graph with the general amount of Steam games that have been released per year on the platform. As we can see, the general amount of games that have been released show an increase in a similar way as Metroidvania games did on their own. Later in this video, we will also look at two more different genres that shall remain a mystery for now, so let's just call them Mystery Genre 1 and 2. But we can still overlay the graphs of Mystery Genre 1 and 2 with the graphs we already have, and we can see that these two genres are also following the trend set by total Steam game releases and Metroidvania releases. But now let's get into the nitty-gritty of what that means. Hollow Knight and Ori are arguably the biggest modern Metroidvania games, and I think most would be shocked to see what it takes to stand out nowadays, and what happens if you don't. If we look at this year specifically, only 9 Souls and Animal Well have been able to break out of the niche and can be considered big successes based on the media coverage and amount of reviews they've gotten. Other games are struggling. 2 examples: Bow, Path of the Teal Lotus, and Biogun, both with only a fraction of the fanfare of the other 2 games, and therefore also way less reviews. A metric that I'm gonna use in more detail later in this video. Biogun specifically is a sad case because according to the devs on Discord, they're struggling hard and only selling 10 copies per week, even though it only came out a few weeks ago and it still has 50k plus wishlists. I've played almost half of Biogun so far and a bit of Bow, and I think they're both good games that Metroidvania fans should definitely check out. Help out some struggling devs here, okay? So is that it then? The market is oversaturated and therefore we can conclude that Metroidvania games will suffer. Though, I mean, you don't need these hypothetical questions, you can see that this video has got like 5 more chapters in it. So of course that's not it. And technically, even though the amount of games has increased, demand might also have increased. So the amount of successful games might have stayed in similar lanes if we look at the percentage of successful games. So to see for myself whether that is the case, I decided to look at all those games and see how many of them failed on a commercial level. Now, how did I do that? If you're familiar with Steam, you know that most games have a thumbs up or thumbs down displayed before you click on them to indicate what the players are thinking. You get one of those labels as soon as your game hits 10 or more reviews. So we can say that every game that has no label, aka less than 10 reviews, has been pretty much a giant failure. I use this metric because it is the only one that we as consumers can fully look into, and even though it does not fully correlate with sales, more reviews normally also means more sales. So if a game has very little reviews, it probably has very little sales and therefore also failed commercially. Anyway, if the percentage of these failed games, aka games with less than 10 reviews, increases over time, then that is not good for the genre as a whole. So while, for example, Haiku the Robot stands at over 1,800 reviews, Lone Fungus stands at over 500 reviews, and Hollow Knight stands at over 324,000 reviews, any game that has less than 10 reviews can only be described as a commercial failure, even if the game itself may be good. I also think another assumption makes sense, that if there's a huge uptake in commercial failures, aka games with less than 10 reviews, then there's probably also an uptake with games with less than 100 reviews, or less than 500 reviews, and so on. Remember Biogun, which I talked about before, has well over 200 reviews and still led to a fight to even stay afloat as a studio. Of course, we also have to take into account that games that released earlier have more time to accrue more reviews, but that normally only happens in large quantities with big games or indie gems that stayed in the public eye, like Hollow Knight or Rain World. And games that only were big when they released, or games that never really got into the public eye, do naturally not see many reviews coming in years after release. So regarding our definition of commercial failure here, games with less than 10 reviews, I do not think that many people will find a game after years and years and review it if it has less than 10 reviews. So my point is that most of the games that show up as having less than 10 in 2023 will probably still have less than 10 in 2030, for example. Not that a percentage point or two would matter, because as we will see in the next chapter, the numbers are concerning. Now, how many Metroidvania games have less than 10 reviews? Well, here's a graph. We start off with 0% for the first few years, and then from 2014 on, we see that the incline starts, and it goes up, and up, and up, and it never really stops. And in the year 2023, 42.3%, 102 out of 241 Metroidvanias were colossal failures with less than 10 reviews. Almost every second Metroidvania game out there in 2023 is a colossal failure, and that affects a whole lot of things. Of course, these games might clutter up the storefront, so even if those games get less than 10 reviews now, they might have gotten more 8 or 9 years ago because there were just less games on Steam overall, so it was harder to completely fall under the radar. There are quite many games in there that have released in 2023 and look promising, but the amount of reviews behind them is negligible. So not all of those colossal failures or games that almost bombed to this extent are straight up garbage. And to prove this, here's a little montage showing Metroidvania games in 2023 that bombed to varying degrees but still very much look promising and maybe deserve a chance. So as a little shout out to hidden gems and diamonds in the rough out there, I wanted to feature a few promising games in the next section. Start the short roguelike montage! So back on topic, my first conclusion from this is that it is already becoming harder for indie devs, and I mean really tiny indie dev teams, to make an impact whatsoever, and creating Metroidvanias will become riskier the less marketing and money you have behind your game. And don't worry, I do actually have one helpful tip that could decrease the chances of failure by about 25%, and yes, I calculated that. It will make sense in a bit, I promise. But first we gotta take a look at a counter argument that I could see coming. that this might not have anything to do with Metroidvania games, but with indie games as a whole and with gaming as a whole. There are more games coming out, so all of these effects I just described can be seen across all genres. That is not true, and I will prove it in the following. I decided to research the same metrics for 2 more genres. One genre that I saw similar to Metroidvanias, but where I see the golden age lasting 2 or 3 years longer, just as a gut feeling of how the genre has progressed in my eyes: roguelikes. Then I took a genre as a third genre that, in my opinion, is as dead as it can really be, to see what the worst outcome of Metroidvania games as a genre could be, and that is the 3D indie platformer. Because, like, name 2 indie 3D platformers that are not ahead in time, that released in the last 10 years and are somewhat well known. I'm sure most of you can't. And yes, those are the 2 mystery genres mentioned before. You're so good at listening and paying attention. Help yourself to some chonies juice. It's on the house. But now, let's look at the numbers. We already looked at the output of games as a whole, and both 3D platformers and roguelikes saw an increase in games that were released, but when it comes to failure rate, the story is different. If we compare the graph of roguelikes to the one of Metroidvanias, at first they seem quite similar. But if we look at it in more detail, we can see that in the last few years, the failure rate of Metroidvanias has increased at a way quicker rate, increasing over 23%, from 2017 to 2023, as opposed to the plus 8% that roguelikes had to deal with. This leaves us with roguelikes sitting at 35% failure rate and Metroidvanias at 42.3% failure rate. Similar and yet different. Meanwhile, the 3D indie platformers do indeed show what a quote-unquote dead genre is like when it comes to these metrics. This genre has been fluctuating in the 40% range for the last couple of years, ever since the amount of platformers that were released increased. So while every one of those 3 genres is going through their own rough patch, Metroidvanias are heading to previously unheard levels of bloat when it comes to numbers of games released, and especially when it comes to the uptake in risk of failure. It is also important to look at these graphs of failure rates with the graphs of total games for each genre in mind, because only once we hit high numbers in the amount of games that were released, we should take the numbers very seriously. So while the numbers for Metroidvania fail rates until 2016 are interesting, I would only really focus on the years from 2014 or better yet 2016 onward, because the amount of games increased and that leads to more reliable statistics. So what is the conclusion that we can draw from this, and what is the tip that I mentioned earlier that could help developers decrease the chances of failure by 25% if they're making a Metroidvania game? Well, first up, the people that are really hit by this are small devs, as I mentioned before, especially if they're trying to make their first game. They don't have a lot of marketing, they might not show up in any gaming showcases at all, they have to advertise everything themselves and end up on a page with hundreds of other similar games in the same year alone. So even if the AAA gaming industry side is struggling for other reasons and struggling rightfully so, the common conclusion that this leads to an uprising of indie games is only half true. It may only lead to an uprising of AA games or already established indie studios. For example, Hollow Knight Silksong is only still talked about so much and wishlisted so much because the first game slapped so hard, so Team Cherry, the developers of Hollow Knight, are established in the industry, with many of the industry bigwigs knowing their name. For other smaller teams, success might be a bit more unlikely in the future, as shown by the failure rates of Metroidvanias. So what can they do? Well, I don't think trends of a global scale like this one can be changed or reversed. But I also surely shouldn't and would never want to discourage new developers from making a game within their favorite genre, even if that genre is currently a very risky endeavor and will only ever become more and more risky. This video serves of more of a bit of a harsh reality check than anything else regarding the genre of games and where it is at and where it is headed. We are marching towards more and more Metroidvanias and it is likely not going to stop soon, so the only thing that I can do is make you aware of these trends and tell you this little tip I found when engaging with the statistics, because the numbers whispered to me and they said the following: release your game in the first half of any given year. I calculated the risk of failure for Metroidvanias in any year and noticed that the later the game was released in a year, the more likely it was to fail. If we count together every first half of every year from 2008 to 2023, we get a total failure rate of 28.5%. And the latter half of each year, that rate is 38.1%, almost 10% more. And since 28.5 is less than 75% or 38.1, releasing a game in the first half of any year makes it around 25% less likely to fail. I don't have the reasons behind that, and there might be a lot of contributing factors why that is the case, but I think it makes sense if you go at it from this angle. Towards the holiday season, many gamers tend to save up for bigger releases and spend their money on those instead of smaller games. And during the holiday season, a lot of online discourse is spent on bigger games, so smaller games often go under the radar. In the first half of the year, however, especially months like January, April, May, they're normally very quiet when it comes to games, so many people tend to seek out smaller games with greater frequency. At least that's my theory. It could all be wrong though, I don't know. Either way, this is the state of Metroidvanias in 2024. Let me know what you think. I hope my math wasn't completely off and everything was clear. Support indie devs, play new games, but also go outside, breathe some air, and support the stizzl YouTube channel in any form you see fit. And go to my Patreon, because I'm poor. See you next time, and bye panada.